This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion.
I like this headline. I like this line. Quote, in the age of fake news, understanding who we trust and why is essential in explaining everything from leadership to power to our daily relationships. End quote. My guests today, Stephen Martin and Joseph Marks, go there with their new book titled Messengers, Who We Listen to, Who We Don't, and Why. Stephen and Joseph get right into the nitty-gritty because in our uncertain and ambiguous world, the messenger is the message. I mean, look, facts and verifiable data are freely available. We all know that. We can all find it. But we really don't want to find it. We want to listen. We want to believe. And as I lay this introduction out, you're probably thinking of the word persuasion. Well, Stephen in particular, that has been a word very close to his heart for a long time. And as I bring up persuasion, it probably won't be too much of a surprise that for Stephen and this podcast in particular, because I like to have really interesting guests, Stephen and Robert Cialdini have had a long relationship as well. Look, this is where it is today. This type of thinking, this understanding of persuasion, this understanding of the messenger. Because if you don't got that figured out, you are just going to be lost, going in a circle. Without any further delay, let's jump right into my guests today, Stephen Martin and Joseph Marks, and discuss messengers. So guys, I'm holding in my hand this fine-looking book and a little bit of self-promotion as we start, for both me and you, that I recognize a couple of these fine people that have given fine endorsements for your book, Cass Sunstein and Bob Cialdini, who both have appeared on this podcast. They're on your book and they're on this podcast, so I have to give a shout out. I mean, those are, if you're putting this type of work together, you can't get much nicer voices in terms of their understanding than those, huh?
You're exactly right. Bob Cialdini has been a colleague of mine for 20 years. We've co-written 2 books together. I was really happy when he was so gracious in his endorsement of the work that Messengers that we've written about. And Joe too has a connection to Cass. And so equally, I'm sure Joe was super happy to get that endorsement from Cass. 2 giants in the world of behavioral science. There's no doubt about that.
Let's jump right into this because you have both put together a work that is very topical for the modern age. You have ultimately, I think, perhaps the most topical example that we can start to flesh out at the very start here and then work back to other examples and work back to other points and whatnot. But I think that in the last 4 or 5 years, Trump versus Clinton, Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton has been an unbelievable smorgasbord of the opportunity to observe behavior and to draw conclusions from behavior. Clearly, you guys have been inspired by both of them in your work. Let's open that up. When you sat down to start to put this work together, how do you bring those 2 people into a work without having each side immediately get hot under the collar that they so despise the other side they can't even listen?
Well, it's tough, actually. I guess where Joe and I started in this program of research, Michael, was with a simple observation. And that observation was that often we're not really paying attention to what people are saying, the content of their message, the wisdom or the truth, or even the foolishness of what's actually being said. Increasingly, it seems that we're largely basing our decisions on who is saying what is being said. For lots of reasons. One fundamental reason is it's really tough to know what the right decision is these days. Which person is going to be the best president? Is Brexit going to be good for the United Kingdom? What school should I send my children to? These are pretty tough, difficult questions to answer. What Joe and I recognize is that when we're faced with that ambiguity, with that uncertainty, increasingly, it seems these days, we're basing our decision on who the recommendation or the message is coming from, rather than necessarily the content or the wisdom of the message itself. And so as a result, the messenger these days has become the message.
Isn't that rational, though, in a world where it's very difficult to know which end is up, what's the truth, what's the facts? Because it seems like these days there are two distinct sides, especially in America. I definitely can see two distinct sides in the UK, but if you got two distinct sides, each with their own set of facts about one particular fact, I mean, it's messy. You're almost left with, well, gosh, maybe the best thing to go with is the person that I feel best about.
Mm-hmm. I think that a lot of these traits are adaptive for various reasons, some of them kind of more evolutionary. For example, we pay attention to attractive people more often and tend to favor them. If you look at the kind of history that our ancestors grew up in, where survival rate was much lower, that makes a lot of sense. Whereas today in modern day society, we have strong egalitarian values and it kind of makes less sense. And so some of these things have evolved to be adaptive, but I think they hold more sway than they really should in today's society a lot of the time. I think dominance is another one where we don't need somebody who's physically strong to run the country or would threaten to punch somebody and beat them up in person, because in reality, they're going to have armies and bodyguards at their disposal and whatever else. But that still seems to hold sway with people. And it was interesting when kind of watching Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, the fact that that dominance was so on display from Trump. The kind of obvious example was just in the Democratic debates, watching him interrupt Clinton 51 times in the first debate, stalk around stage. These are signals that are indicative of a trait that doesn't go unnoticed by people.
Now, what's interesting about what you said, I would take a gander at that. There's plenty of people that would say, well, yes, he was doing that, but it was strategy. Yes, he was doing that. It wasn't because of any particular, I truly dislike this person. Obviously, they had both been at all each other's weddings and all that kind of stuff. So they were clearly friends behind the scenes, at least before the election. So it's funny, was that strategy or is that an insulting, disrespecting behavior? I think there's probably two sides in America saw that two different ways.
I think you're right, Michael. It's probably a combination of both those things and a couple of things more as well. There are people, and we all know them in our life, that have that predispositional dominant personality. They're the kind of characters that when they walk into the room, their goal is to win. To the victor goes the spoils. They literally spread themselves around the room. They command a greater space. They put their feet on the table. They're big, they're brash. That is a kind of personality trait. But I think you're right in terms of this idea of a strategy as well. Some really interesting research that Joe and I found when you look at, say, for example, the appointment of executives, so C-suite executives in organizations, is the current performance of the company will often have a significant influence over their likelihood to choose a dominant over a less dominant leader. Companies whose stock prices are perhaps not performing as expected, there's low levels of psychological safety in the organization, there's not a clear strategy or direction that they're going in. Boards are much more likely in those instances to appoint dispositionally dominant, assertive leaders. But the opposite is true in calmer times when things are going well. Now, I think that there are people out there that know that, clearly. Trump seems to recognize that, whether or not it's something that he's figured out or whether it's just intuitive. But he seems to recognize that if people prefer a dominant type of messenger in times of anxiety and strife and fear, then let's create some fear, let's create some anxiety, because that's the perfect environment now where my dominant personality is likely to carry sway and is likely to be more attractive to people. I think it's probably a bit of both.
As you use that word attractive, let me go back to the word attractiveness. I was thinking about, maybe I'm missing somebody here, but I was jotting down American presidents going back in time a little bit here. So I'm thinking Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Obama, Trump, I would think everybody except Trump, when they came into office, was probably considered a very good-looking man. And I think Trump would have been considered a good-looking man as a younger man. But he's an older guy now, and he doesn't look as good as he did when he was 45. I mean, that's just life. But I think for Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Obama, they were probably considered very attractive men. And that had to have played a huge role in their winning. I mean, I can think of some of the folks that they went up against were probably not as attractive. I mean, I don't think people would say overall, for example, that Mike Dukakis and John McCain were as attractive as the other names that I just mentioned. I'm not trying to get you to agree with me one way or the other on their attractiveness, but I think it's probably a fair assessment.
I think it is true. And there is evidence that more attractive political candidates tend to do better than those who are less attractive had they stood in the same position. They typically kind of look at an incumbent or a challenger and compare if it was a more attractive or less attractive person, how would they have fared instead? And there is one study in the Journal of Public Economics, I think, citing a 20% benefit from a boost in attractiveness. And they measure it through, I think, 1 or 2 standard deviations, which is kind of a scientific way of measuring distance. But essentially, the more attractive the candidate was, the more likely they were to get elected. Now, that wasn't a big presidential election where many traits matter, I think, because it's so high profile and high public on display, then a variety of things are going to matter, including their policy position, including many traits such as their dominance, their competence, their charisma, but also their attractiveness probably does come into the mix too.
If we're looking at the debate that you brought up, we think back to what that imagery was. I think Trump is around 6'3". I'm guessing Hillary Clinton is probably 5'4" to 5'6". He was a much bigger guy. If we would have flipped that script for that particular point in time in history, and this gets to the idea of the messenger has become the message, if, and I'm not trying to paint any kind of a, people might say, well, this is a sexist statement. It's not meant to be. I'm just literally talking in the content of where you guys have gone. But I would have think that if Hillary Clinton would have been a 6 foot tall, model looking woman with her political positions in heels on stage next to Trump, she would have been president.
Possibly. It's an interesting idea, isn't it? And one that we'll never know the answer to. But I think what is true throughout all of this discussion so far, Michael, is at no point are we talking about the merits of their policies. At no point are we talking about, would this person make a good president because they have an idea about a direction to take the United States in or a way to manage fiscal policy? We're not talking about those things. We're talking about these ingrained innate traits. Who's the tallest? Who's the most attractive? Who appears the most dominant? And I think the fact we're talking about these things speaks to the very essence of, we'd like to think that we weigh up all the pros and cons of policy and manifesto and what they're going to do and what they're not going to do and what they stand for, these kind of things. That's really tough to do. Often we just kind of fall back on these inherent traits and use those to decide, well, okay, right, well, maybe this person is going to be perhaps the better choice of the two. And I think it's also fair to say in this instance, it's probably especially amplified given that these aren't two standout candidates. There was a lot wrong with both these candidates in this instance. Perhaps, arguably, the situation is amplified even more.
Obviously, though, with the title of your book, Messengers, I'm driving at this very issue that you guys dug into, because this is the way this kind of guttural, kind of emotional response to appearance and behaviors and all these things far outweigh. I mean, the potential, as you guys say, the potential whips the achievement. For example, I mean, what's driving us, we can see this, for example, we can go off on an example for something like WeWork in a second, but people that come into the public sphere today and are pushing the potential and all of the opportunity into the future, and I'm going to lead you there, that is swaying all of us much more so than the person that walks in with, for example, the Hillary Clinton resume or the John McCain resume, which are both extremely long and look like superstar resumes. But the American public said, nah, we're not interested.
You're exactly right about that. I mean, potential is certainly much more interesting than past performance. If you are a new player on the stage, as Obama was in 2006 when he started his presidential campaign, same as with Trump in 2016 when he announced. They had no, Obama perhaps a little bit in terms of his time in Chicago, but Trump hadn't served a day in public office in his life. Notice how he played on that potential. Think of how things could be different. There are studies, actually. Zach Tamala is a brilliant social psychologist over on the West Coast of the US, has actually studied likelihood in certain circumstances to choose the candidate who has potential over the candidate that perhaps has the experience. And I think that probably helped Trump as well. Hillary, probably the most qualified presidential candidate in history, but actually just Trump was a little bit more interesting. He had that potential. And another thing that added to that list of features that swayed the decision.
There's probably someone on the right out there listening who would say, hold on, a little bit more interesting. He's the one that was packing 20,000 people into a stadium where she couldn't get anyone to listen. When people hear the message, when they hear the explanations, you're going to have people that immediately everyone's picking every word apart these days, right?
Yeah, but no surprise that those 20,000 people in those stadiums, did you look at the number of people that were behind him, not just in front of him? There's an interesting idea, isn't it? Is that audiences now see that he has crowds behind him. And we know from, well, you've already mentioned Bob Cialdini's work and that idea of normative behavior and following the crowd. He's very, very clever in ensuring that wherever he goes, there are crowds that surround him. He's signaling popularity, he's signaling that potential.
Let me shift you away from the politics to a concrete example from a movie that I dearly love, and a lot of people love it, The Big Short, based on Michael Lewis's book. There's this great character, a real life character in the movie named Michael Burry, who figured out that all these mortgages were worthless and he shorted everything and he made a bundle, a lot of drama along the way. At some stage of the game, and I'm going to let you guys pick up on this, at some stage of the game, I guess he was called in front of U.S. regulators or Congress or whatnot. But instead of bringing Burry along, the guy that had all this brilliance, they reached for Michael Lewis. And Michael Lewis has all the brilliance in the world too, but he was not the guy that did it. He was just the guy who was telling the tale.
Exactly, yeah. He was just the guy that wrote about it and was therefore the one in the spotlight because it was his name on the book, The Big Short, not Michael Burry's name. There were other characters covered and Lewis seemed to have all this knowledge. But what was really noticeable was that he was noticeable. He was the prominent one, the salient one. In that context, then, it seems that the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission had a kind of focusing illusion effect where they couldn't kind of see beyond the high-profile messenger and actually go to the source of the insight, the person who understood the problem from doing the research and who was actually able to make the predictions on the subprime mortgage bonds, which was, of course, Michael Burry. What's really interesting about Burry is that he was a kind of classic Wall Street Cassandra, which was the term that was actually given to Warren Buffett, who, unlike Burry, was incredibly successful and everyone listens to.
But they didn't listen to Buffett in the late 1990s, though, and everyone said the old man was over the hill and all that kind of stuff.
Exactly. It proved unwise because the dot-com bubble did then crash and Buffett's reputation then has soared and remained largely untouched ever since. Whereas people do listen to Buffett, and if Buffett speaks now, people will put down what they're doing and take heed. Whereas Burry, it was a very different story. And if it was not for Michael Lewis covering his story, probably his name would be unknown and unrecognized, even though he was the one that kind of spotted the faults in the subprime mortgage bond to begin with.
Now, the funny thing is if I'm guessing the call before Congress or the regulators was before the film The Big Short, because we know they weren't reading books. That's just a slight dig. But I'm sure they would have called him in if they would have seen the movie. Then they would have called him in.
They did call him in eventually. But here was the really interesting thing. He gets called to this hearing. The chairman of the hearing, the very first thing he says when he welcomes Burry to this hearing is, "Oh, thank you for attending. We heard about you in The Big Short." So that's the key there. We didn't hear about you. We didn't find out because of your expertise, because of your competence, because of the fact that you was able to predict this mess that was actually about to happen. We heard about you from a different messenger in that instance, who we've already spoken to. So they did eventually call him, but only after they originally called Michael Lewis to testify.
Let me put a word out that is part of your work. That's a really important word. beyond the famous presidential candidates we're talking about, beyond the big short guys. And this is for all of us. Every aspect of our lives, every day, small or large, status is driving us. We are driven by status. We're driven to status. Status seems to make the world go around. And just to add one little side tangent to that you guys can run with, so much of status today is fake.
You're exactly right. You're exactly right. In the book, we largely categorize messengers into one of two types, if you like, of messengers: hard messengers and soft messengers. When you talk about status, we're talking about those hard messengers. They're able to get their message heard because they are perceived by their audience. And the key word here is perceived. They are perceived to have some form of status over their audience. They have some socioeconomic position. They're rich, they're famous, they're well known, or they have competence. They have status because of their skills, their experience, their knowledge, their instrumental value that they can give to others. Or, as we've already spoken about, they have dominance, or they have physical attractiveness. And those are the four hard traits that largely signal someone's status over an audience. They define the hard messenger traits. And you're exactly right, Michael. Status counts for a lot. One of the very first things that we ask people when we engage and meet with them for the first time is we say, okay, so tell me, what is it that you do? We're literally asking, where on that socioeconomic status are you positioned, and how am I relative to that position? That's what that question does. It gives us a sense of someone's status, and it drives a significant amount of our decision making. We infer lots of things on the basis that someone has status and believe them. And often what they're saying can be false. One of the examples we talk about in the book is a Cantonese pop star who claims on WhatsApp that the flu vaccine is likely to give you the flu. 9 out of 10 people that get a flu shot are going to get influenza. I mean, that's a nonsense. But because it came from that status-orientated, rich, famous person, it quickly became a virulent message. And health professionals are now having to scramble to kind of eradicate this fakehood that's being broadcast from an individual that has no right to talk about those things, but has status.
It's really carving up an interesting world for us, that where in the past, if it came down to an issue of government, politics, money, economics, psychology, health, there would be a trusted voice that across the spectrum people would reach for first. We would go there first. We would trust that even if there could be some perceived partisan whatever, we would generally go to where this person over here has got the real insights on vaccinations or whatever the issue is. We're going to put our trust there. But now that we've opened up the world, something that the genie's never to go back in the bottle, now that we've opened up the world to everyone having a megaphone, like the Cantonese pop star that you just mentioned, with social media, stop and think for a second what the end game is for that. I just don't know how people tell up from down, right from wrong, the truth at a brief point in time in the future, or if we're already there.
It's startling when you put it in those terms, isn't it? The progression I don't see as going any other way other than the way it's been going so far. I mean, there's talk of various kind of ways of dealing with these issues. To my knowledge, then, it's not actually stopping the problem of influence going into the hands of what are now called influencers, and those influencers having just some form of status or potentially connectedness to their audience that mean that people are likely to listen to them even when they don't have what would be typically known as kind of subject matter expertise. They're not an expert in their field. It's just that they have a voice with a certain target audience.
Now, this can also go both ways, though, because if we look at somebody like Kylie Jenner, I think she's 21, 22 years of age. She's a billionaire already. She, just using social media, essentially hacked the cosmetics world, put this status out there, not really anything there except some family fame. Wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. Entire industries built upon decades of experience just get cannibalized overnight.
I think that's the benefit in a way, in a sense, that people are able to, for example, YouTube bloggers, they are able to make themselves in this low barrier to entry market. In a sense, you can get people who come from nowhere, who have something that other people want to hear, actually getting their voice heard and making it. But I guess that's the flip side. It is possible, but I think very unlikely for that kind of 1 in a million. But it does happen, of course, that people do end up going viral and do end up making themselves into a high status, well-heard person or messenger through that process and through those platforms.
As I give an example, let's just imagine, and I see this across the internet quite a bit, some young guy selling something is in a expensive suit in front of a $1 million car. Now, to people with a certain amount of experience, you just look at that and you go, okay, he's just selling something. But unbeknownst to us people like me that maybe just say, not pay attention, a lot of people are paying attention. What is happening in the mind that we can't separate anymore, that we don't even ask a question? We just see, again, the messaging is disappearing and just becoming the messenger, but we just see the messenger. And as long as there's some bright, shiny stuff, the $3,000 suit and the $1 million car, whether or not that individual owns it or not, a lot of people aren't even asking that question.
Exactly right. Again, it's this example of where you lay it out like that, Michael. It sounds unnerving. It sounds frightening that people would react to these things. But what we're reacting to are these salient cues. It's tough to come to a decision accurately about whether this person is worth listening to. Do they have something valuable to say? Is my life going to be improved if I reach out and connect with this individual? Tough questions to answer. We answer different questions. And the questions that we answer are things like, well, he looks like he's pretty successful. He's got a Ferrari behind him. He's got that $3,000 Brioni suit. He's got shiny shoes. Those cues are consistent with what I would expect a successful person with high status to essentially have in their possession. We'll often use those cues to make inferences about whether or not we should continue to follow them. And it's not just individuals. Think about organizations. When we go into company head offices and we see all those clocks telling the time in different cities around the world, it's unlikely if we walk into a bank headquarters in New York that we actually want to know what the time is in Hong Kong or Jakarta. What those clocks are doing is they're sending a signal about that organization's global reach, their expertise around the world. And we infer lots of other conclusions about that. As they've got these clocks around the world, they must have offices around the world, they must be global, they must have lots of experience, they're probably worth listening to. That's what's going on there. We're replacing the difficult question to answer, should I listen to this person or this organization, with what are the signs that comfort me or reduce my uncertainty that allows me to listen to them. It's kind of what's going on.
Let me shift it into a controversial character. Controversial is actually the nicest thing I could probably say. This guy, he was what was he at Michigan State? Larry Nassar. This guy was the doctor for all these young gymnasts. Apparently was able to, for I guess decades, to be the doctor for the top female gymnast in America. I've read some of these news accounts. I mean, just insane stories of doing these massages and stuff with these gals that was just horrible sexual abuse. And he got away with it. But I think the question starts to come up is, what kind of trust was going on with the parents? How did the parents not trust the girls when they were saying there was a problem? How did they just unilaterally trust that some grown man is in a room with their young daughters doing who knows what? And how could you even get to the point to trust like that? I mean, there's so many insane issues that spring up with some of these examples, right?
Mm. Yeah, no, it was a fascinating example from a trust perspective, as well as a kind of horrifying real world example of some truly horrific stuff going on that went unnoticed for a long time. Like you say, Larry Nassar was celebrated as the Olympics doctor. He was an osteopath for a long time, treating the girls who took part in Olympic events, and was absolutely kind of adored, loved, and trusted by them and their parents. The reason that he got away with it for so long is because there was this large element of ambiguity in what he was doing. because he was performing these procedures that required him to put his kind of fingers down in sensitive areas near kind of sexual organs, or sometimes touching or pressing against sexual organs. And it was a legitimate medical procedure. What was clear was that in the end, he was going far beyond what he was meant to be doing and sort of taking liberties with that trust that was given to him. I don't need to go into the graphic details, but the fact is he went far beyond what was medically required of him to do. When the stories first came out, it was from the gymnasts who had been abused themselves, saying, I think that he abused me. What was kind of very disheartening was that, like you say, a number of the kind of parents themselves didn't believe these stories. They thought that maybe the girls didn't know exactly what he was doing for them. Maybe they'd misunderstood in some way. A big part of that was that he had this character that just didn't seem to fit with what he was being accused of. He was the friendly guy next door who would help his neighbors shovel snow. He would take them if they fell over straight to the hospital. He was very, very patient with all his female kind of clients, the girls who were in the Olympics and training. He was their favorite person. He would do anything for them. He had their back, and they could see that. But there was this malign undertone going on that they didn't know about. And the only reason that they eventually came around to the idea that actually maybe he was sexually abusing them was that they found hardcore child pornography on his hard drive, and he'd thrown it away in the bin the days that these kind of stories were coming out. And the police checked and they found the hard drive. And with this real concrete evidence in their hands, then their minds started to turn. And that's what it took, because in the situation where there was ambiguity, they just couldn't believe this kind character that they knew could possibly be doing these things.
If I just take the word messenger and we think of an individual, I sort of look at your work, your book that I'm holding in my hands, kind of like the Swiss Army knife of trying to understand all the different aspects and advantages of what makes a successful messenger, what brings us to accept that particular individual. What is the backstory here? How do you both go down this path of putting this together?
It largely came about by all these different situations that you're bringing to life now, Michael, through your questions. Continually, Joe and I are asking ourselves, how is this person being listened to? Or how can this politician hawk fake facts? Why is it that people are listening to this story on social media rather than the truth? This answer kept coming up. Ambiguity, uncertainty. How do we know where to look? That's when we started to think, well, what are the traits? What are the factors that we are all using, regardless of our age, our experience, our cultural upbringing, and our expertise, to determine whether someone is actually saying something that's worth listening to? And that's where we uncovered these 8 traits, those 4 hard messenger effects that we've largely been speaking about, but also these 4 soft messenger effects. Sometimes you don't necessarily have to have status over your audience to be heard. Often a messenger is able to be heard because they have a connectedness with their audience. They don't seek to get over their audience, they seek to get along with their audience. And they do that by their signals of warmth, their signals of trustworthiness, sometimes their vulnerability, and often their charisma. That's the kind of the full set of these 8 traits. And you're right, they kind of work like dials. In some instances, the warm messenger is more likely to be listened to than the dominant one. But in other situations, the rich and famous one will carry sway over the trustworthy one. Context and the situation matters a lot, but these are the, for want of a better word, the 8 universal messenger traits that we increasingly rely on to determine who we should listen to and who we can reliably just ignore.
Here's another example to throw out at the tip of my mind. Again, staying in American political craziness for a moment. In the last handful of years, the word Russia has become the operative word in American politics. The crazy thing to me is whether it's the side accusing Trump or Trump's side, there is no resolution. The messengers are keeping the messages vague, amorphous. There's no end to the message. And I start to think, well, this is just a strategy. Nobody wants to have an end because it's so valuable to keep. Both sides want to keep this thing going. used to be where people want to get resolution. Now I keep saying, well, gosh, the messengers don't want resolution. They've become crack cocaine. They want us addicted to whatever message we're taking in. To me, it's so frustrating. I've started to tune out a lot. I just don't pay attention because there's no resolution.
Well, it certainly sells newspapers and online newspaper subscriptions. But again, I think you're onto something here. What it also does is it creates this environment of near constant uncertainty. In environments of uncertainty, we don't know what the truth is. We do this in the same way as we were talking a few moments ago. I don't know if this guy is rich and famous and has something worthwhile to say, but he's standing behind a Ferrari and he's got a cool suit on. So perhaps I should listen to him. In this political uncertainty that we actually have now, where there is no clarity or concreteness about what the truth is, what's really happening, we start to rely on these messenger traits again. If we are in this conflict with Russia, perhaps a dominant, demanding, commandeering president who seeks to get on with the Russians and seeks alliance with them probably might be the better choice to lead us through this uncertainty than perhaps someone who's actually saying they're a danger to us and we need to move away. This is exactly what's going on. I think there probably are a lot of people that are starting to tune out, but my hunch is that most people are still being just captivated by this uncertainty, and are being, driven by this ambiguous story. It's keeping it alive, and as a result, because of the uncertainty, we're going to make our decisions not necessarily based on actual fact or wisdom. It's likely to be one of these functional messaging traits that decides on where we put the cross on our ballot paper.
I think my perspective is a minority perspective, not because I'm all that. I just think for whatever weird circumstance that I'm in, not inside the States a lot, I just think that I've become kind of an outsider to the whole thing. But when I observe other Americans, you're right, they seem enraptured, captured by this, unable to escape whichever side they're on. They can't escape the drama. I guess it's similar to, I guess at one point in time I was addicted to watching sports a lot too. I'm not now, but I guess when guys get addicted to watching sports, whether it's football in America or football in the UK, in some ways this has become sport. Watching the messengers give their message is the new sport.
Yeah, or kind of glamour magazine.
There you go.
The soap opera.
Yeah, exactly. Soap opera. That's the word I was looking for.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And to me, I think if you treat your kind of elections as a reality TV show, then don't be surprised if you get a reality TV star as a president. These are the kind of contexts that they thrive in, where the status matters, how you are on camera, and the dominance and charisma that you have really count for a lot. So if that is the context in which we're electing not only a person, but a party, then don't be surprised if that person tends to fit the bill in that sense.
Can charisma be learned, do you think?
It can be. It can be. Although what's interesting about charisma is it's only been in recent times that the scientific community, the persuasion sciences and behavioral sciences community have come to some consensus about what charisma actually is. I think for many, many years, we've looked on enviously at those individuals who seem to be able to carry the crowd, who seem to be able to get an audience to eat out of their hands, and just believe that it's something that they were born with. But we do now have a definition for it. It's largely defined as a messenger's ability to convey a compelling vision that an audience sees themselves as part of a broader group. They want to move in that direction. And charismatic messengers typically have surgency, that positivity, that ability to convey a message that unifies people. There are traits that one can learn. For example, sometimes it's not just the words you use when you deliver a message, but the whole interaction that your words have with your body language. There have been researchers that have looked at successful TED Talks where two presenters that are essentially delivering a speech about largely the same subject matter with the same insights. Let's talk about leadership. But the TED Talk presenter who uses more hand gestures, typically about twice as many hand gestures as perhaps a less charismatic messenger delivering the same message, will be viewed more. It will be viewed as a more enrapturing speech. People are likely to view it more, listen to it more. It's more likely to be shared. Nothing's changed about the inherent content of what's being said. It's just in this instance, that message is being delivered by a charismatic messenger. So there's an example of how, some of these traits can be learned.
If I look at the last two U.S., and I know I've stayed political today, but they're such great examples for your topic. If I look at the last two USA presidential elections, Obama, McCain, Clinton, Trump, to me, they look very similar in a way, even though the winners were different parties. Obama had charisma. I mean, I was in Saigon, Vietnam when he came to visit. Most Vietnamese did not know his politics. They did not know one way or the other, but they had seen him on TV. They had seen a magnetic smile. They had seen a good-looking guy. He seemed cool. So when he came to Vietnam, from the airport to downtown Saigon, perhaps a 15 or 20-minute drive, the streets were lined with hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, just this desire to hear, they're completely outside of even knowing the politics, just drawn to personality. You know, I'm sure some of my friends on the right are going to say, oh, Mike, you're making it sound much better than it is, da-da-da-da-da. No, I was there. It was crazy. I mean, he's like a rock star. Might as well have been the Rolling Stones. It was insane. And it was just purely by what they perceived as this kind of magnetic charisma. It was really an amazing thing to see in person.
Yeah, and surely the star status of Obama, like you say, he's a tall, attractive, cool guy. They would have seen him on the world stage with these huge crowds. It's not every day that we get somebody like Obama coming to our town, or the Queen is another example. I agree with you, though, that Obama had a special charisma to the way he spoke. I mean, people like Trump, I think people like to do impressions of Obama. He has that very idiosyncratic way of speaking, and it did attract huge followers. Unlike Trump, he had a great lexicon and rhetorical ability. In fact, that's unfair to Trump to say he doesn't have a good rhetorical ability. I think
it's a different style.
It's a very different style.
Yeah.
Yes, it's simple and direct.
Right. It's this authentic guy you're having a beer with at the bar kind of style.
Exactly. And that can be charismatic. What it lacks is a certain rhetorical devices like the metaphor, for example, that you see actually used in many presidential speeches. In fact, there's research showing that the more metaphors are used in an inaugural speech, the more charismatic the president is likely to be seen, and actually the more likely they are to get voted in for a second term.
Let me use an example of myself, just to be not cocky, but just a fun example as I'm thinking about everything in your world. The first time I had a chance to speak to an audience in China was 2006. I'm sure I stood behind a podium and was probably pretty boring. I didn't read the slides, but I probably came close. Then fast forward, 7 or 8 years, maybe 9 years, and I had a chance to give a presentation to a room full of investors in China. It was like 1,000 people. And my attitude was completely different. I remember, if you do this charisma thing right, you stop thinking about what you're doing. You just be yourself and you give the energy. The people want the energy. So when I ask you if charisma can be learned, I believe that it can 100%, but it's definitely tricky. And again, I bring my example up to think back to how could, if we're just talking strategy of people improving their messaging ability, how could, for example, Hillary Clinton have improved her messaging ability at her age? Could she have? I don't know. Now, obviously, her husband was completely practiced at it and was considered one of the best. So it's a really interesting thing. Can you shift at a certain point in time, or was she going to be forever somewhat stuck using the resume approach, meaning like, hey, I'm the most qualified and experienced candidate, and couldn't compete when she came up against a charisma type candidate?
It's a fascinating question as well. And what you're talking to now is essentially that conflict between hard messengers that have competence or dominance or a position, some status, and the soft messenger who is warmer, more connected. And it seems to me, in your example, when you first spoke 7 or 8 years ago in China, you had some form of status. The fact you were standing on a stage, the fact you were behind a podium, the fact you were being introduced. I can't remember now, Michael, whether your book had actually been published at that time, but you were a noted author. You probably had a number of those status-orientated traits that are available for the audience to actually see. By stepping out from behind the podium, connecting more, working on that vision, that charismatic delivery, you are able then to encompass some of those warmer, connected traits. I think to a certain extent, that's probably where Hillary Clinton probably was at a disadvantage. She was largely considered cold. She wasn't considered a particularly likable individual, a likable politician. That connectedness, that warmth, that trustworthiness with her electorate, with her audience, was often missing. But she didn't seem to perhaps, in my opinion, it's only my opinion, but she didn't seem to perhaps focus so much on that. The unrelenting message was, no presidential candidate has ever been more qualified. Look at the competence I have. The fact that she actually came from a legacy family, the Clintons, probably just added to that status. She was perhaps a little too one-sided, a hard messenger, and perhaps on reflection could have perhaps balanced that out with perhaps a warmer outlook, as it seems that you have done in that career path that you've just described in terms of your first and latest talks in Asia.
Ultimately, it seems like the messengers that have an authentic understanding of behaving like a peacock seem to do well.
And flash their tails and show off as big and beautiful creatures. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I mean, that seems to be, I know, for example, in my little example that I gave with you guys, when I stepped out from behind the podium and I became a little more animated, you can feel the audience. You can feel the energy. And this gets back down to the root behavioral issue. I don't know if it really would have made a difference what I was saying, as long as I was giving the people that were listening energy and excitement and entertainment. This is sadly what's going on. But I think that's the whole beauty of what you guys have done in your work, is to get us to think about all these issues and what's going on with us human beings.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And what's fascinating is we talk about a study that was conducted a little while ago by Nalini Ambady and Robert Rosenthal, where they looked at teachers. So kind of what you were talking about, communicators who stand up in front of a room full of people and just talk and try and deliver information that could be imparted to their audience. What they did was they took 10-second clips of these teachers and showed them to a group of naive participants who didn't know the teachers without sound. All they saw was their kind of 10-second video of their nonverbal behavior. And they had these naive participants rate the teachers for various traits such as their optimism, their enthusiasm, their confidence, their dominance, the electrifying stuff that you were talking about. And then they correlated those ratings with the teachers' actual end of year student evaluations. And what they found was that those teachers who did well over the course of a term of teaching tended to be rated as higher on these superficial traits from a 10-second clip with no sound. The people who were seen as confident and inspiring and optimistic in 10 seconds of video actually got better grades from their students. It's not necessarily that they knew the course material better, that they had a better knowledge of mathematics or English or whatever it was. It was that they were able to show these peacocking traits that you talk about, that they had the right communication style. And as Steve is very fond of saying, often it is the case that looking and sounding right is more important than being right.
I want the audience to realize, as I'm leafing through the book right now, the book is dense. There is serious references here. There's a serious index here. So you guys there's no shortage of endnotes. Let me ask a question and see if I don't necessarily know where you might go with it, but as we wind down here, you've got all these interesting people that are colleagues that have seen your work. Clearly they like it. Is there anything feedback from the pros when you guys are really in the academic nitty gritty where I've not really taken you today? Is there anything from some of those peers of yours where they've really given that kind of aha moment feedback that they really liked an area that you went that perhaps I've not talked about today?
Well, first of all, I think it's really important that Joe and I signal that we've been incredibly lucky. We do have a wonderful, rich network of some of the most preeminent researchers in the world that are working on these types of topics. And it's been just so wonderful to get their very well received, certainly from us, their endorsements for this work. I think the aha moment is not necessarily from the insights themselves or the specific outcomes or findings from particular pieces of individual research, but the way that Joe and I have actually treated it in terms of synthesizing all this research, because you're exactly right, there are hundreds and hundreds of studies. We actually found it pretty difficult to finish writing the book because every day we're served up with new research and another story in the press about a messenger effect. But the thing that our colleagues have been most, I think, positive about is the way in which we've kind of categorized these effects into universal traits that are understandable by everyone. In fact, you can go to the book website and even take a test to get an understanding of where your own personal traits as a messenger, where you're strong, perhaps where you're less strong. But that synthesis, to break them down into hard and soft effects, and then list out the 4 hard and the 4 soft effects, seems to be the thing that our peers and our colleagues have found most useful, because it's not been done since the early 80s. The last time that a pair of researchers looked to kind of categorize and come up with a model for how messenger effects influence society was back in the early 80s. It kind of brings it up to date, makes it more contemporary. So that's, I think, what has been especially well received from our peers and our colleagues in the academic community.
The book, Messengers, Who We Listen to, Who We Don't, and Why. And then you just put it all on top of social media steroids, and then we're off to the races, right?
Exactly.
You guys got a website we can send people to, the book at Amazon, all that kind of fun stuff? Where can we direct people to?
Well, if people are interested in actually finding out about their own characteristics as a messenger, they can go to messengersthebook.com. They'll find more information about the book. They'll find more information about these 8 traits. There's a neat little quiz that they can take for free. They can even start reading the book for free as well. We've put the introduction and the first chapter up online for people to review, see whether they want to continue reading. So that would be a good place to start, messengersthebook.com.
I really appreciate you guys coming on. You know, I've been really lucky with this podcast as a guy who's written some trading books and then started doing this podcast. And my podcast shifted around episode, I think, 210 or so, because once you have the most famous living psychologist on your podcast, Mr. Kahneman, then things change. And so that I've just become addicted to having every bright behavioral guy, gal, come on this show and teach me something, because honestly, it's the most interesting stuff on the planet these days. It's just the study of people and the decisions we make and what we do. And there's so many different vantages on it. So many different researchers coming at it from different angles. And it's like, wow. Sometimes you think, well, I've got it now. I got the human condition in my mind. No, I just talked to someone else. I don't have it yet. You guys must feel like this all the time too, right?
It's still interesting and fascinating to us. And I think that's why we both got into it. I mean, for me, I certainly know it is. It's funny how it does seem to be sort of turning people who are traditionally in kind of finance or other areas similar, and making what was kind of confined to academic journals and psychology classrooms for a long time really accessible, and to see how it's so relevant in all these other areas, like you say.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing. What a fun time to keep learning. Again, the book, Messengers, Who We Listen to, Who We Don't, and Why. Guys, thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Michael. Cheers. All the best.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.